Thank you, Wolf, for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be here. And wow, this is a beautiful part of the earth down here in New Mexico. And it really is. I want to say that it's my wish, speaking of how beautiful it is here, it's my wish and will that all women in prostitution will be offered the choice to escape it. And that all of them and all of us and all women will have great grandchildren who can enjoy how gorgeous this planet is and who can live good lives. Starting with this little one over here. So I work in prostitution research and education. We've been doing research and education and public policy advocacy. I was in public policy advocacy hell earlier this morning because I was dealing with the big boys organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and their UN women friends. We have been pushed back so hard, but I'll tell you, I was born in the middle of this fight. My activism around pornography and prostitution came partly when I got a letter out of the blue saying, there's this woman being kicked off the San Francisco task force on prostitution. Would you write a letter to the task force saying you don't think she should be kicked off? And I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, it's made up of people who are seeking to decriminalize prostitution. And this is what they said about her, she's too negative about prostitution. She talked about how she was kicked in the head by her pimp who had steel-toed boots and it fractured her skull and things like that. And that the best help she got was when she was put in jail, because at least she was protected from her pimp. So I was in the middle of that fight to begin with, and I remember saying at the time, well, I don't know anything about prostitution, but that doesn't sound right to me. And so I wish I could say we've come a long way, but we're being shoved back hard in this war on women. Very hard, and I'm so glad to be here. So, and I can tell this is kindred spirits. I hope some of this will be useful to the struggles you'll get involved with as far as policy, and that'll help you wend your way through some of the confusion that is being thrown at us right, left, and center about what prostitution is, what trafficking is, and what pornography is. It's complicated, and I've learned a few things, and I've made lots of mistakes. So here's a few things I have to say. So prostitution and porn are not sex or risky sex or work. They're sexual abuse, which is really on a continuum with incest, rape, and battery. And it's been very helpful to me to hear what someone said years ago, which is prostitution is to the community what incest is to the family. And there's a profound truth in that. I've thought about that many years. Prostitution and trafficking and pornography are all the experience of being hunted down, tracked, harassed, sexually exploited, often assaulted. That's from the victim's point of view. That's what it is. really the best model we have to understand prostitution is battered. And it comes out of the battered women's movement, who understood so many things. And unfortunately, the wheel is being reinvented in the prostitution abolitionist movement. For example, the battered women's movement learned that counseling, support, and education doesn't really solve the problem of battery. Men really don't need to learn that when you put your fist like this, pull it back and hit her face, it injures her cheekbone or eye or nose. Similarly, men don't need to learn that when you buy an extremely vulnerable young woman who's got a long history of sexual abuse, of racism, of poverty, and is so dissociated that she's not really there. Believe me, they have a lot to teach. Johns have had much to teach me about dissociation. They know it when they see it and they use it. So, educating them about the harm of prostitution, trafficking, and pornography, I'm not sure that's the way to go. And you can imagine what I think the way is to go. It's the way they tell us is the most effective deterrent to prostitution. Any amount of time in jail. This is exactly what we learned in the battered women's movement. Consequences are necessary for harms against women. I'm a psychologist. I'm in favor of counseling. Fine, that's fine, but consequences first. Pimps and sex buyers use the same tactics that batterers use. Isolation, minimization, rationalization, economic control, degradation, all of those same things to keep women in line. Sex buyers and porn sex buyers are from every race and class and ethnic group and religion. I want to mention a few men who have long histories of sexual abuse and purchase of women, but were never charged with a crime. As you can imagine, they have a fair amount of political power. One is the governor of New York, who trafficked women and used something called the Emperor's Club VIP, which is a porn site and an escort agency. You can't tell those apart anymore. We just can't tell which is which.
Are you talking about Cuomo?
Elliot Spitzer. Pre-Cuomo. I don't know what Cuomo's up to. He probably doesn't know where to be. But Spitzer had a long history of purchasing women in prostitution and trafficking them by moving them from state to state and to Europe and back to New York. Then there's a recent case of the owner of a football league who was videotaped purchasing a trafficked woman in a massage brothel in Florida. And he managed to get the videotape of himself exploiting and harassing and raping her for money. He got the videotape excluded from the trial. And I'm not sure, I don't think he's done any kind of jail time. No, that's what I thought, yeah. Closer to home, there's the former president of the University of New Mexico. Does anybody know about this guy? My email is on the program. Please send me emails if you need any more specific information. I'm happy to share it. I love hearing from people. The former president of the University of New Mexico was part of an online group of faculty and other men who ran an online escort agency, recruited women in prostitution to be part of that agency, and who sold women to his colleagues. This is common among academics and students. The name of this group was, what the guys called it, that were part of it, was the Hunt Club. And that's exactly what it was. It was a Hunt Club with all of the implication of that meaning. He resigned fast. So let me describe a recent case in Sweden that explains, I hope, the intimate connection between pornography and prostitution. And I'm going to try and make the point to you that today, in this world, we can no longer separate filmed and non-filmed prostitution. They're the same thing. If you talk to women whose prostitution was filmed, I mean, just to get into this, if you can imagine the most humiliating event of your life being filmed and then put up on the internet, that's what it's like. Pornography, part of what it's like. So in this case, and Erica Bergquist and I, because she's an anthropologist in Sweden, she and I wrote an article, and we quoted the pimp in the title of the article. And what he said in trial in Sweden was, if you film, you're not buying a whore, you're producing a movie. I'm glad to hear gasp, because that's how I feel about that too. These are clever guys, these sex trade businessmen. I feel that now, for 28, 30 years, they've always been a few steps ahead of us, and always a few steps ahead of me. It's like I feel like I'm running to catch up with them. But this is an instructive case. Let me just tell you a few things about it. In 2021, a Swedish woman had the courage to report to her local police that she'd been pimped into prostitution and that she'd been raped many times. The victim had gone with her pimp to the home of a sex buyer. The sex buyer paid the pimp for the session with the woman, and the pimp filmed the session, explaining to both the sex buyer and the victim that if you film, you're not buying a whore, you're producing a movie. The pimp was nonetheless convicted of rape and trafficking under Swedish laws. Don't applaud yet. It gets worse. Much, much worse. I wish. In the original conviction, you know how long they were going to put him in jail for rape and trafficking? 1.5 years. You get put in jail for stealing two-down jackets in the United States that are worth $400 when you're cold, but you don't get any kind of penalties significantly for doing this kind of stuff. So the pimp appealed the court's decision, and his rape and pimping charges were dropped because the pimp and his attorney convinced the Swedish appeals court that he was not a pimp, but a pornographer. Now, the implication of this is pretty clear. If a pimp wants to avoid being charged with this crime of rape, trafficking, or in some states, prostitution, under Sweden's law, all he had to do was film his crimes. Bring a camera along with you and you're home free. At this point, the crimes will be named pornography and declared to be protected speech. Have you ever heard that one before? And it gets even worse than that. The Swedish Court of Appeals agreed with the pimp and his lawyer that the rapes could not be proved because the victim signed an agreement to perform certain sex acts. Now let me tell you, because this is something that we have to argue all the time in this field. she consented. She signed an agreement. She knew what she was getting into. Well, here's the conditions under which this woman signed this agreement. One, she was so drunk she couldn't remember or hardly even see what she signed. Psychologically defeated and intoxicated, she signed an agreement that listed about 15 acts of torture. And I'm actually not going to say them here because it would be too much to listen to, and I'm going to spare you that. But if you want to read them, this article is up at prostitutionresearch.com. We have a large free library of materials, and just put in that title, and this article will come up with all the details of what she was coerced by the pimp into agreeing to do. She signed an agreement to be tortured and filmed in order to work off a friend's debt to the pimp. What was her logic in agreeing to this kind of debt bondage to save her friend? She told the court that she herself was already a destroyed person who was suicidal, and so it didn't matter what happened to her anymore. This is what prostitution does to people, and this is what pornography memorializes and keeps forever, is this level of despair, self-loathing, and suffering. So, like the Swedish Court of Appeal, U.S. courts have agreed that if prostitution is filmed, it becomes the pornographer's speech. Here's an example from the U.S. A film showed 251 sex buyers humiliating, raping, and torturing a woman named Grace Quett. Sex buyers paid to perpetrate life-threatening sexual assaults, which resulted in her severe physical and psychological injuries. The filming of sexual assaults of 251 sex buyers was stopped after 10 hours because she was bleeding internally. After being edited down, the film of the men raping her was named pornography and titled The World's Biggest Gangbang. So U.S. courts, like Swedish courts, have made very, very bad decisions around prostitution and the filming of it. One good case has happened, which I want to tell you about. In the U.S., even, a guy named Glenn Marcus ran a torture pornography website. He dominated and coerced a woman to permit pornography of her to be sold on a website called slavespace.com. If you ever, I have to say this to everyone in the room because I know that you're activists and care about these issues. If you need to look at pornography, do it with someone else, not by yourself. Because you need to talk to other people about what you're looking at. You need to cry, and you need to have someone to support you. So please don't. This woman actually managed to bring charges against Marcus, who was her pimp, pornographer, trafficker, and torturer. At one point, he had stuffed a ball gag into her mouth, sewed her mouth shut, and hung her on a wall. Her attorneys, this is what I want you to remember, this is the good part. Her attorneys used a definition of trafficking that was very powerful, and they won. Here's the definition. Sex trafficking is coercing or selling a person into a situation of sexual exploitation, such as prostitution or pornography. Do you hear how the definition of trafficking includes the word prostitution and pornography. This is a very hard legislative battle to fight, Sharon, but we have to do it. We have to get our definitions of trafficking and not just the US federal definition and state variants of it that only recognize super extreme cases where a woman is bleeding or has had a gun put to her head and kidnapped. Those aren't the way trafficking and prostitution go down today. You don't need a gun. Just need somebody that's hungry enough to agree to turn a trick for a hamburger or a tank of gas to go to a job interview. Both of these are examples that have happened in the United States in the last few years.
More likely a shot of heroin.
Well, and a shot of heroin. I mean, I heard someone, it's my feeling that if you can't psychologically dissociate, which women tell us is necessary to survive being either in prostitution or having a prostitution film, if you can't tune out and go away mentally, you use chemical dissociation. I am 100% convinced that most of us, certainly including myself, would be getting our hands on every drug we can get a hold of. To do several things, not just to assuage the psychological pain, but the physical pain that women in prostitution suffer. So I'm not, there's this thing that says women are addicted and then go into prostitution. My opinion is that there might be recreational drug and alcohol use before somebody gets into prostitution, but once you're in prostitution, it amps up into a full-scale addiction. So it's not as simple as some have suggested, but thank you for bringing that up. No, thank you. It's a really important point. And
They call it the leash. Heroin is the leash.
I've known many women who are not addicted to coke or heroin and whose pimps shove their faces in it to make sure they're addicted. It's a great way to control somebody. So, Robin Morgan, the feminist, years ago, that woman wrote, "Compartmentalization is the best tool of patriarchy." Isn't that the truth? Nowhere is it seen more, although I'm sure there are people in the room that would argue with me, but in the field of prostitution and trafficking, everything's separated from everything else. Pornography from prostitution, child from adult prostitution, indoor from outdoor prostitution, legal from illegal. It's all pretty much baloney. This is an international, criminally controlled industry that hooks up with local pimps, and it's an international corporate-like business. And they have all kinds of arms to the sex trade, and if you can separate off, for example, if you can get people to focus their legislation only on people that are under the age of 18, then what are you saying to these women who blow out the candles on their 18th birthday cake? Yeah. Not you. You don't count anymore. We think you're making a choice. So, how would that have worked with the anti-slavery abolitionists in the US if we walked onto plantations and said, "Are you under 18? Are you under 18? We'll take you, but not your mom and your older sister." I don't think so. It's an industry, as long as there is any kind of a sex industry, any kind of prostitution of adults, there are always kids. They're worth more, and they're easier to control. From a pimp's perspective, which is how we have to think some of the time in order to figure out what their next move is going to be. So, and the same is true of pornography. If we think that having a camera in the room changes things, I think we're ignoring many, many women's abuse. And I want to tell you a little bit about what survivors are telling us about the camouflage of pornography, how that camouflages abuse by filming the prostitution. The pornography is camouflaged as content creation or speech, rather than a filmed record of prostitution, humiliation, or torture. Porn pimps, and I swear they're all porn pimps today. Every pimp out there, especially since COVID, every pimp out there is filming. They just make a few more bucks that way. And that's the purpose of pimping or trafficking, which are the same thing. Pimping and trafficking are the third-party control of another person, where you're getting the money, the pimp, the trafficker is getting the money from the sale of another human being, who he controls through drugs, but also through psychological coercion, using very sophisticated techniques these days. So I think we cannot separate pornography and prostitution anymore. And here's how survivors talk about that. Pornography is filmed prostitution. Another woman said pornography is prostitution that's legal as long as someone gets to take pictures. Another woman said you get money for having sex. It's as simple as that. The only difference is that one is documented and the other isn't. And then my favorite retired ex-FBI agent, Roger Young, said, what happened to common sense? The fact that there's a camera filming the prostitution doesn't change the fact of the prostitution. Pornography is essentially crime scene surveillance tape. You can't say to someone, hey, let's go rob a bank. But if we film it, then it won't be robbery. Yeah. I mean, I love his logic, and it's just cutting through the BS. So, we did 3 years of interviews in Sweden of women who had been in prostitution and pornography. And these were in-person, 3-hour interviews with a team of 12 interviewers, and the report is written up, and it's free, again, on our website. And the title of the report is that filmed prostitution is inseparable from unfilmed prostitution. We recruited people on Instagram. Nothing I like better than talking to people about how to do research in your community. You don't need an advanced degree, you just need a methodological mind and to know what you're trying to show and be transparent about it. Figure out how to get the best kind of responses from the people you're talking to. That's why we did this research, because we wanted to hear from young women, including young women currently in pornography production, and hear what their experiences are. We even interviewed some women who were pro-porn. We did not exclude them from our study. It was a difficult, painstaking process, let me tell you. But we learned from them too. And here's what we learned. 64% of that sample were filmed in prostitution without their consent. This is 2 years ago. That's the pornography that is being used on OnlyFans right now. One woman explained when it comes to porn, a lot of people will think there's a studio, but it could just as well be filmed abuse. The viewer will never know. The viewer will never know if there's consent, and even if there's consent, the consequences are still there. Our interviewees' boundaries were constantly being overridden. The amount of time they agreed to spend, the acts they agreed to be filmed for or not filmed for, they were pretty much ignored. And OnlyFans is certainly no exception to porn production. Pornography production, just like prostitution, is associated with extreme violence. 84% of our women in pornography had been raped in the sex trade. 43% threatened with gun, knives, or weapons. 25%, and this is one of the most under-discussed areas in the field of prostitution and trafficking, is organized crime. 25% of our interviewees named international organized crime. Keep in mind, this is in sweep, progressive sweep. They named Hell's Angels, which is everywhere where prostitution is legal. Banditos, original gangsters. These are international organized crime. They also named Nigerian pimps who are working very closely with Italian pimps to follow up on the post-colonial racist marauding of Africa and the sale of African women to other African men who were then sold to colonists. And I hasten to add that the Romanian mafias are also operating internationally in Europe. So pornography advertises prostitution, pornography facilitates trafficking. One woman explained porn, she was talking about the differences between, because we asked the women in our research, what are the differences and similarities between pornography and prostitution? And she said, pornography shows what you can do, and it shows your experiences. Can you suck well, masturbate well? Can you take the whole thing in your mouth or not? Can you swallow? Sex work is just something you do. You just lie there like a dead body while someone else enjoys it. You know, we need to quote those kind of things to the young women who are getting such lies about pornography being a great job if you need $5,000 or $8,000 to pay your college tuition, which is, and sugar daddy, sugar baby prostitution is being advertised as mutually beneficial dating. We have to deconstruct every word out of the pimps' mouths. It's exhausting, it's not fun, but we can do it. I know, we have to, because they hide the violence that's right in plain sight. And so for the young women that are currently being propagandized by this, and again, it's so similar to the pro-sex self-ID movement, isn't it? It's the same kind of propaganda, the lies, the kind of, I'm a renegade and outlaw. How cool is that? And progressive. How do they go there? It's about as reactionary as you can get. I don't give up the word feminism with any adjective in front of it. I'm old school. I don't think there's mainstream or any other kind of feminism. There's the war on women, and feminists are people who are fighting for women's right to exist and for women's equality with men. End of story. said, feminism is about pulling one more man off of one more woman's back. It's in the trenches, that's what we do. So I think I want to end with a couple activist thoughts. Banks, banks, and banks. What do banks, website, payment processors have to do with porn? What I would say is everything, because today it's all online. At one end of the transaction, whether it's to buy a photograph of her prostitution called pornography, or to buy a commercial in-person sex act, there's the woman's bank on one end, Venmo, Swish, Kik is the payment processor. That's a bank that's doing that, big bank. On the other end is the sex buyer and the porn sex buyer's bank. We're not paying attention to these banks. They play a major, major role in laundering pimp money. Please remember that. They could protect victims. Banks could protect victims when they see this kind of stuff going down. Instead, banks are attempting to get off scot-free, saying they're just conduits, they're not involved. Well, a couple good things happened last year. The world's largest bank, JP Morgan Chase, settled a lawsuit brought by Epstein victims. Did you see this? It's incredible. The lawyers for Epstein victims won a $290 million settlement from JP Morgan Chase for trafficking. Now you know banks don't cough up that kind of money unless they're scared, unless they're about to be busted. Deutsche Bank, same thing, $75 million settlement with Epstein victims. Epstein, of course, was a pimp who was connected with very, very high-level sex buyers and pornography producers. Let's pay attention to banks and expose their complicity in this business of prostitution, trafficking. And finally, let's give women in pornography the kind of services they tell us they need, which are exactly the same as the services needed by prostitution survivors. Housing, 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 legal advice, individual counseling, peer support from other survivors who've been there, done that, and can say, look, I made it out, you can too. This is like the detransitioner parallel with the sex self-ID. When we talk about getting women off the streets, that's where it's easiest for those of us who are not survivors but are allies. That's easiest for us to connect with them on the street. But never forget, they are moving to where the sex buyers are. That's military bases, that's online prostitution and trafficking, it's indoors, it's escort or cell phone prostitution, it's wherever the pimps send them. 84% of all adult women are controlled by third parties. 84%. So they're doing what the pimps say, and they're moving. Indoors, outdoors, street, inside, massage parlor, webcam, all that. I just want to say, it's tough navigating all of this, and may we all choose our battles wisely. So, thanks.